Right. Welcome back to Senate Education. Looking at S-169, acts relating to virtual learning, which I suspect will end up in the miscellaneous education bill or in a committee bill. The genesis of the bill was the Agency of Education called me and asked if I would put this bill in to get this conversation going and to see what the committee thinks about this idea. So with that, Ms. St. James, I'm going to let you take us through the whole thing, and then Mr. Carolis will have you chime in a little bit there or testify, say a few words toward the end, and try to get our next witness in at 3. Thank you.
St. James Office of Legislative Counsel, S-169 is entitled an act related to virtual learning. This is, you'll see all the language is underlined, so we're adding a brand new statute to Title 16, and we're plunking it in the courses of study chapter, which is chapter 23, in the flexible pathways subchapter. So just to orient you all, there is a flexible pathways initiative in Vermont that is in statute, and it's to encourage and support the creativity of school districts as they develop and expand high quality educational experiences, to promote opportunities for Vermont students to achieve post-secondary readiness through high quality educational experiences and acknowledge individual goals, learning styles, and abilities, and to increase the rates of secondary school completion and post-secondary continuation in Vermont, right? So that flexible pathway is kind of self-describing. There are several options for what a flexible pathway could include. Flexible pathway to graduation could include, and again, this is all in statute. And one of those is virtual learning and blended learning. And that is to set the stage for this new statute that the bill proposes to add to this flexible pathway subchapter, section 948, titled virtual learning. It requires AOE to maintain an agreement with a virtual learning provider for the purpose of offering virtual learning opportunities to Vermont students. Then it sets out some requirements for a student to enroll in virtual learning. So the student has to be enrolled in a public school, enrolled in a middle or high school program. Virtual learning has to be found to be a beneficial option under the student's personalized learning plan. And the student's course of study meets minimum standards under guidance promulgated by the agency. Then AOE may adopt rules to implement this section under the Administrative Procedures Act and rulemaking. And then a school district shall count a student enrolled in remote learning in the school district's average daily membership if the student meets all of the criteria in subsection B. So if the student is participating in virtual learning, and they have to do that, they have to meet that criteria in subsection B, they count towards the district's average daily membership. And remember, we use that number to calculate per pupil spending, which affects our homestead tax rates, etc.
So, Mr. Carolis, what's the problem we're trying to solve here?
So I think, and when I was looking at the bill language, there were, I did have some suggestions. I think we, under the education recovery, have had an opportunity to pilot some full-time student enrollment online. We do have an existing appropriation under section E504.1 to the Vermont Virtual Learning Collaborative, which is housed under the River Valley Technical Center. But we know that as it's housed under the Flexible Pathways initiative, there are sort of two areas. One is we haven't historically supported or had clear delineation and guidance around full-time enrollment, and also the option of having students who are not secondary students. So this would be these sort of K-6 students who are also engaged in full-time online learning. So I think the pandemic afforded us some opportunities to pilot some innovations that I think have been really effective. I think there's been also some national research that has sort of borne that out, particularly around students who may respond more positively to online and blended learning environments. And so I think that this bill, I'm really excited about, poses an opportunity for us to just flesh this out a little bit more so it's a bit clearer so everyone knows what to do.
Yeah, I'm still a little confused. So if you could take us a step back, start with again, what's happening out there right now and what exactly this bill is going, how it's gonna make a difference. Give us an example. Give us
Sure.
a kid who's in 8th grade or 9th grade, whatever.
Mhm. So we have right now students who, through agreements, and we have a grant that goes to VTVLC that provides the infrastructure and the virtual ecosystem by which students in school districts can take online courses. It's highly effective when you have courses that may not be on offer within the school district, and you have students who are wanting to engage. I think world languages is a great example.
So that's very important. So VTLC is not mentioned, I don't think, in the bill. So tell us what that is again.
VTVLC is the Vermont Virtual Learning Cooperative. It was created over a decade ago. It's an education organization that has been our sort of statewide facilitator of online learning through a cooperative approach in which school districts are partners, and they can be teaching partners or non-teaching partners where they get some number of free enrollments, but it's how folks are able to offer courses in a cooperative way across districts. There's a great efficiency step there that allows for students to take courses that may not otherwise be within their local school's course of study.
Great. And there's a great website, vvlc.org, if people haven't. I remember this in the past. Okay, please continue.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
John is sitting at school, he's taking this class.
Yep, he might be sitting at the school, he might be at home, he might be at a CTE center. And it can be either full-time. So when it's in a full-time environment, we do actually now have full-time Vermont licensed educators through VTVLC who are providing instruction. And we've funded that through our ESSER funding, our statewide ESSER funding. But it may also be, students who are trying to maybe expedite their learning career. And so they might be taking what they call on-demand courses, which allow for them to maybe tailor a pathway through their PLP. And so they might be taking it at night. But it is an opportunity for students to both meet their graduation requirements, but also engage in some planning beyond their graduation requirements.
Several weeks.
Thanks, sir. Yeah, Jess, good testimony. I reading through the bill just very quickly, it really does focus more on full-time versus part-time. I certainly get the need for like specialized courses for somebody who's looking for a language that's not offered in a school that's only got 10, 15 graduates per year. Those specialty courses are things which answer the curriculum demand of that particular student. I get that, but why the full-time focus of this particular bill? In that it requires specialty instructors and
right.
Like it's up a whole new regime.
Yeah, and this is where I'm getting into, and I'd be happy to send along. And I'm not sure maybe who provided the language, but I would make some slight modifications so it's more consistent with the subchapter. First of all, I do think it's important, and it's an advancement, which is we describe dual enrollment, we describe early college, we describe high school completion program. Virtual learning is listed in the definitions under section 942, but we don't have a statute around that governing it. I would change that to, like part-time or full-time. I think right now there is some difficulty for school systems to understand how to interpret and report students who are full-time when they don't have it. We also have been advancing some really interesting pilots around what we are calling the collaborative diploma program, in which non-operating districts through consortia agreements with an operating district can offer public education to their students, and it's facilitated through VTVLC. So again, it's expanding options for students to continue in their public education. And I think that full-time piece is something that we haven't really had some structured policy around. So I wonder if accidentally the part-time pieces, the one-off courses were excised, but without intent.
So just to kind of get a perspective on scope, how many full-time virtual learners are there in the state right now?
Yeah, so right now we have 151 full-time students enrolled through VTVLC alone. And that's about an even split between 9-12 and K-8. And I would say too, actually a student presented at the Act 77 celebration, for a lot of students who this environment is the right fit, thinking about them developmentally and thinking about what they may have specific learning disabilities that really respond well to this kind of environment, or students we know who may have different identities that in which they feel more secure and safe in a smaller community and have been thriving in the online learning environment, and wanting to make sure that there's a clear pathway for students who have been very successful. It's not a huge number. We do have a much larger number of students, you know, in the normal traditional pathway where they're taking one course or two course, right? We have 812 unique students who are, you know, doing that, taking like a class or two here or there.
Senator Sheen.
Thank you. I have a few questions, I think, and I apologize if you've already covered this, but you know, with the students that this bill is trying to cover, why not just have those students go through VTVLC?
This would be the intent, right? Because again, and when I look at, and not knowing who, where the language came from, I would probably slightly modify some of it, which would be, especially that introduction, which would be that the agency would maintain its existing relationship, right? We already govern them, so that you know, something like the Agency of Education shall maintain access to and oversight of a virtual learning provider. VTVLC is actually already called out in section E 504.1 in the budget bill, to the degree that whether we want to put into law something that what happens if, say, as an organization or program, it decides to shut down, you know, perhaps having more global language makes it a little bit more evergreen.
Thank you. And
But there's no anticipated changing the provider, right?
yeah, okay, I think I understand. Thank you. And
Because, sorry to interrupt, but because we can't put a provider in a bill. I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah, so there's already the virtual learning provider that exists that we're using.
Correct.
Okay, and so this would kind of expand that agreement?
I think what it does is it codifies a couple of things as I read it. And again, I would maybe make a recommendation for a tweak or two. One is it addresses this issue of full-time. And I think the other possibility is that it would provide for us to identify that the minimum course of study and appropriate learning pathways that are outlined would be consistent with enrollment in a flexible pathway. And that will help us to clarify some of the reporting mechanisms that folks engage in and some of the guidance we've been providing around whether students of certain ages and certain dosages of course taking are permissible.
Got it, thank you. And just the reason I'm asking is because, you know, as I was reading this, I was thinking back to a conversation that I think happened the first week with, pretty sure it was Jay Nichols, and, you know, we were talking about taxes and costs and spending. And, you know, one of the many concerns was the financing of private services that aren't available in schools. And so that's kind of what I was thinking of, and that's what I was just trying to dig around a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the power of this is because it's a cooperative, it doesn't compete with schools, it provides a service to schools at the state level.
Thank you. Awesome, thank you. And I think just my last, I guess, comment is, I do also want to just make sure we're aware of how hard virtual learning can be. for some students. I'm just getting flashbacks to COVID when, you know, I was watching my own daughter trying to go through virtual learning with really bad internet, and it was tough. And obviously, I know that's different than what we're talking about here, but, you know, virtual learning may not be for everyone, but I just want to make sure that there's a, you know, if it is going to be for certain students who are trying to get certain credits, I just want to make sure that there's a good,
Mhm.
I guess, good standards or a good set of requirements, just to make sure that the student will thrive in that with virtual learning. That's
I think that's a very good point around standards and requirements. Getting on the website a little bit, at least the VLC, yeah, might be fun for the committee at some point to sort of pull that apart, just to get an understanding of the quality that's out there. Senator Weeks.
Yeah, just one's an observation and then second question. So my observation is that, you know, I understand that different students excel in different environments, but it's almost like going back to Senator Hashim's point that we're almost creating an economic or an educational silo that does kind of enhance isolation. Maybe because that's what the student needs. Yeah, personally, I don't get it, but some students may need to be kind of sheltered from all of the challenges that go with public schools. Okay, I get that to a degree. But so now my question, is there like a funding note associated with this? I'm not sure that's the right term, but is there like a cost associated, a notional cost?
So I think
Sir,
a couple things. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, is one of the benefits is that there's already an existing appropriation and has been for over a decade. And I think what we would recommend is that continue to support access to this pathway. You're 100% correct. It is not for everyone, just like dual enrollment is not for everyone, early college is not for everyone, CTE is not for everyone, work-based learning is not for everyone. So to that point of saying, remote learning, we know, was an emergency response. It was not planned. But what the power and opportunity of this bill, to both of your points, is that it provides us the opportunity to start to build out and codify those best practices and standards, which we actually already know of and have. This idea around making sure that you have teachers who have OST certification so they can be teaching in the online teaching environment. Making sure that they have licensure, making sure that they align to standards, making sure that they align to standards related to online and blended learning. All of those things we've done that work. We also have a provider who has been in this field for a very long time, and does not compete with schools, but rather provides opportunities for schools to offer pathways that maybe they wouldn't normally be able to offer in-house.
And again, this is happening. This sort of formalizes some of the work that is going on right now and gives more oversight to it.
Yeah, and allows us to build out the guidance, I think, is at the bottom, that really gets into, okay, even how do you report your data, right? How do you do this? How do you do that? Which working on, I think, because there's been some mixed messaging, I think certainly the pandemic didn't help because there was this emergency response and emergency closure and then remote learning. It got muddled. I would also just recommend and draft, and again, I'm happy to send this along, or, you know, perhaps work with you, Beth, but changing the definition of virtual learning, I think, will also provide some clarity. And that's in that section 942.
Would you mind sending us a little memo on that? We'll have you
100%. Yeah,
that would be great.
absolutely.
So Jess, you said that there's existing funding for this. Was this created through ARPA funding, the current program? And
So there's two things. There's the existing flexible pathways funding. Again, in the budget bill, if you look under E504.1, we have appropriations for dual enrollment, supporting dual enrollment, virtual learning, early college, high school completion program, secondary school reforms. That has been in place since I've been at the agency, which I won't say how long, but it feels like a short time. And that I would recommend stays in place. It's been highly effective. It allows for folks to actually stay in their school communities, particularly if they're needing to take courses that perhaps might not be offered. I think the CDP program is also really powerful in developing. So we already have that appropriation. The recommendation would be to maintain the status quo.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there for now.
Sure.
St. James.
I know you asked Jess for a memo, but do you want me to work with Jess to just get
That'd
you
be
a
great.
draft?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great.
Perfect. Okay, thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Morgan, is our next witness here?
I believe so.
Sarah, okay.
I love the shit out. You're still.
Yeah, we're
We're
studying yet, we're moving into PCBs soon. How are you?
Hi, good afternoon. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Welcome to Senate Education, Sarah. How do you pronounce your last name?
Villeneuve.
Beautiful. Great, thank you. So you're gonna talk to us, and we don't have a lot of time. You're more than happy to come back another time, but we do have testimony on PCBs starting soon. So tell us what you'd like to say and your thoughts on S87.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. I'm a high school language arts teacher at Bellows Free Academy in Fairfax, Vermont, a very small rural school, but we've been teaching a Holocaust studies class in our English language arts department as an interdisciplinary class for almost 20 years now. I took over the class in 2017 when my colleague Rick Potash left the school to go teach in the southern part of this country. And this class has been incredibly successful, in engaging students in a learning that was missing from our curriculum in other places. And so I'm speaking to you today as a seasoned educator who's been doing this for quite a while in a very small school and seen just amazing impacts on our school and our community. So I just want to talk a little bit today as both an educator, and I will also share that I am on the Vermont Holocaust Education Board for the Vermont Holocaust Memorial because I believe in this and I've been working with them. I am not Jewish. I do not have a family history of Holocaust survivors like many of the members of the Vermont Holocaust, but I speak as an educator who's been doing this for a long time and has seen the impacts and really believe fully that the importance of mandating Holocaust education goes beyond what we currently can see just through looking at a general social studies lens of the proficiency standards. So I just want to say that, one of the reasons why I teach the Holocaust and continue to keep this course going in our school is because the Holocaust is a stark reminder of the violation of basic human rights on a massive scale, and mandating Holocaust education helps to instill a commitment to human rights, teaching individuals to stand against injustice and atrocities. Educating people about Holocaust serves as a means to prevent the reoccurrence of similar genocidal events. By learning about the consequences of unchecked hatred and discrimination, societies are better equipped to recognize early signs and take preventative measures. Holocaust education is not only about historical events, but also about understanding and addressing contemporary issues. The resurgence of anti-Semitism in recent times, even here in our small rural state, highlights the need for individuals to be educated about the historical roots of the prejudice and its destructive consequences. And I know that my colleagues and friends from the Vermont Holocaust Memorial have talked about how 26 other states have already adopted this and in their education. And it's just imperative that Vermont considers the importance of making sure that students understand and know not just the history of the Holocaust, but the impacts that continue today. Anti-Semitism often stems from ignorance and perpetuation of stereotypes, and Holocaust education plays a crucial role in countering the misinformation and providing accurate information about Jewish history, culture, contributions, and dispelling harmful stereotypes. In the face of these rising anti-Semitic incidents, individuals need to be informed and equipped to respond effectively, and Holocaust education empowers people to recognize anti-Semitism and speak out against it, and work towards fostering a climate of tolerance and acceptance. And I know that there are many concerns about mandate versus our proficiency graduation requirements. And I just look at We do require our students to take US history courses. We do require our students to take physical education courses because we know that these things improve their outcomes. We know that we want kids to have this information, and there are very few areas where we're very specific about what kids need, but it's all based on data. And I think that the data that's been shared with you from the Vermont Holocaust Memorial really shows that there is a need for this education, and that the impacts of having this education in other states has proven to be absolutely helpful in helping to decrease anti-Semitism in those areas and increase the knowledge that students need to equip themselves to be better citizens in our society. So I just want to speak in support of this bill as an educator who will continue to do this, but it's not required of me by my school. And I just wish that more of our students across the state had access to this type of learning as part of their mandated requirements for graduation.
Questions or comments? You teach language arts?
I do.
So how do you incorporate, can you just tell us a little bit about perhaps books that you read or how do you inform students through the language arts process?
Well, we read a variety of informational texts. We read a variety of personal narratives. We incorporate, we use all of our English language arts proficiencies around reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and in order to address the proficiency standards, but it depends sometimes on the interest of our students, sometimes by the guest speakers. The book choices have changed. I have an entire cabinet full. This last trimester, we read Heidi Fishman's book that she wrote in conjunction with her mother because she came in and spoke to my class. Every trimester, I think we've read the play, The Diary of Anne Frank version. We read Elie Wiesel's Night, but we also are reading informational texts. We are learning about the art of the Holocaust that was created by Jews and other prisoners. We were just reading a news article about the recent discovery of some of the music that came out of composers who were imprisoned during the Holocaust. So I try to pull in a wide variety as more of a humanities aspect. I'm dually certified in English and social studies, so my global citizenship background really plays into that history love as well. But we really try to look at it from the eyes of not just the victims, but also looking at the survivors and the contributions as well. So my students have had, we've been really fortunate to even have Elie Wiesel's son speak to our class. We have a lot of guest speakers either Zoom in or come and visit us personally who are Holocaust survivors or second generation Holocaust survivors. We've also had the opportunity to go to the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Museum there. The one that's closest to us, of course. We've done the virtual tours. So there's a wide variety of different ways to engage students in this learning.
Any other questions or comments? Please, first of all, thank you. Thanks for all the work that you're doing as well as for taking the time. And I hope you'll continue following our work on this issue. We're trying to think what might be the best path forward for our state, for our students, and certainly appreciate everything you're doing. And we may invite you back in as we continue the conversation, but this has been very helpful. And then I would just close there. If there's anything in particular that has stood out over the years that how you taught your students or what texts, please, if you would email Morgan Feldman, our committee assistant, he can then share it with the committee. It would be terrific.
Yeah, I'd be
Great.
more than happy to. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you all listening and looking at this bill seriously as a way to move forward.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye now. Okay, shifting gears, we have, let's see, Dr. Levine and Secretary Moore with us. Do you both want to come up together? How do you want to do this?
I was gonna let Dr. Levine start and then maybe we'll swap out, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Dr. Levine, how are you?
I'm ready.
I also see we have other people in the room. Mr. Chapman, my new neighbor, by the way. Sears and I live up that way.
Oh, do you?
We should
You should stop in sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So we are talking about PCBs, and before we get started, because we don't have you and Secretary Moore and others in the committee very often, I just want us to go around and introduce ourselves, so you know who we are in our district.
Senator Terry Williams, Rutland District. Senator Dave Weeks, Rutland District, come from Project.
From Canby, Benton County.
Martine Hewitt, Chittenden Central.
Not a machine, Wyndham County.
Doctor, the floor is yours. Yes, this is the house where you have to wait another 30 minutes.
Mark Levine, Commissioner of Health. Thanks for inviting us today. We have a sort of a tag team approach.
Great.
I thought I would do some level setting and bullet points just to act as a review for the committee. Because I don't suspect you've been talking about PCBs frequently. And I won't belabor them, I will make them fairly crisp. So obviously we have a whole program in place, and we've talked about this topic before because PCBs are toxic and can cause health problems. They vary from cancers, which always gets people interested, specifically melanoma, breast cancer, and lymphoma, not just those, to non-cancer effects, which have been increasingly been really the focus of attention in recent years. And they may be very interrelated. So they can go from immune system issues, keeping in mind that the immune system is meant to keep foreign invaders out, to reproductive system issues. And there's been significant evidence regarding lower birth weights, increased levels of prematurity, to neurodevelopmental kind of issues, whether it be early learning or visual recognition. And then endocrinologic, which mainly have been in the thyroid hormone arena. Remind you, thyroid hormone is sort of a major metabolic hormone. So things like growth in the fetus and in the infant could potentially be impacted. There's been a fair amount of discussion, at least in some in the legislature, regarding the route of entry of PCBs into the body. Yes, indeed, it can come from your diet, whether it's fatty fish, fatty meats, etc. Fairly ubiquitous, but depending on how small you are, and I mean small by age chronologically usually, the amount that comes in through diet has less and less impact on your total burden of PCBs the older you get. So for the very youngest, pre-K and earlier, the air may not be the major component of how PCBs get in. But very quickly from the pre-K years on, it's quite dramatic how what you breathe is actually what is potentially done hard. And we use sort of the rule of how much, how long, how often to try to quantitate potential impact on the person. The EPA has a program called TSCA, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act. And it's noteworthy that PCBs are one of the 6 chemicals that are regulated through that act. As you know, there are abundant chemicals in the world. This made the grade and it came to being one of the top concerns. So it's a very elite group. So it wasn't just chosen out of a hat. It's really a very concerning group. Unlike all the other chemicals in that group, this one is the one that air is one of the biggest portals of entry. So in other instances, you can avoid certain things. It's hard to avoid breathing. The former presentations we've made have had a lot of emphasis on how did we get at the levels we have? How do they align with EPA? Why are we different when we're different? I'm gonna actually not dwell on those and get too technical today, but obviously if there are questions, we answer what we're asked. But I'd like to go beyond that, because I think even all of the schools that we've been dealing with, no one's making issue with actually how we set levels and what that means for a particular room. They're much more now involved in the more downstream impacts of what they can do about the situation they have. Obviously, we had legislation passed. Burlington was sort of the big glowing kind of concerning area that arose that kind of put it on people's radar screens. And now basically every corner of the state, people are aware that these are important chemicals and understand the whole program of testing and what have you. And we know, of course, that it's essential, it's especially pertinent to Vermont because of the age of construction of our facilities. And all you need to do is be pre-1980 in your construction or renovation, and you qualify to be in the program testing. And there are well over 300 that are slated for testing total. So you're going to hear from Secretary Moore a little bit about some of the data that we've come up with. But just to give you a little bit of perspective, we tested just shy of a third of the schools. We're almost up to a third. And one thing that I don't think gets paid attention to, obviously, if your school has a severely high level, it's well known. But basically 62-ish to 63-ish% of the schools, we've been able to say, you're fine, and reassure people, even though your school was built this year and renovated that year, what have you. So I don't want people to lose track of the fact that just like when you go get a bunch of labs drawn or get a screening, whatever, for whatever cancer, sometimes there's good news. And the good news can be reassuring and confidence building when you're either a student or you're a staff member who spent several decades working in that institution. But about 37% of the schools have had findings. A majority of those findings have been at what we call the SAL, school action level, which is at a lower level than the sort of urgency provoking immediate action level, IAL. 13% of those schools that had this positive test had an IAL exceedance, some part of the school. So the theme is this is prevention in action. And when we're able to be reassuring, that's great prevention. When we actually find something, the majority of schools were finding something that we can actually be comforting and reassuring about when it comes to what happens tomorrow now that the test results are in. But obviously the schools that make the big news are the ones that have had a major room or part of their school where they've exceeded their IAL, and the hard talk about what's going to happen begins to occur. So real time, we're protecting our students. I thought I would close my comments with a little bit of a question that we get asked frequently, sometimes by legislators, often by parents and other community members. Are people getting sick with cancer or other diseases from the PCBs that are being found in school? And if we can't measure this, should we be concerned? Or why should we be concerned? So obviously I can't discuss privileged health information, but we certainly get calls, emails, questions from staff, parents, etc., with concerns that they have based upon what they know about PCBs, wondering if this is a related to the PCBs or not. We can't always definitively say what you have told us is related to PCB exposure. But many of the concerns we're getting, and of course, there's a little selection bias because people know about PCBs, are quite consistent with what the literature says they could be complaining about based on what we know. And as a rule, we should never wait for people to get sick to take action on something if our goal is really prevention health effects by preventing exposure. So certainly the responsible thing to do, which we do, is review the hundreds, if not more, peer-reviewed studies, some from the animal literature, increasingly from the human literature, about large populations of people who've been exposed to PCBs. And there are administrative governmental bodies like IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. There's also the CDC, the EPA. They've all basically stated in the strongest terms they can state based on their criteria that these are toxic chemicals. And basically, we don't really feel we need a Vermont study to sort of add to the literature. And indeed, it would be hard to do with the small numbers that we have. Very hard to achieve statistical power when you have a state as small as Vermont and regions that get even smaller. Whether you're talking about PCBs or whether you're talking about, I live in X, Y, or Z, and I know 5 people who have lymphoma in my town. Is there a cancer cluster there? Very rarely can we actually say yes, because again, we don't have the statistical power to be able to do that. And there's enough variability in the illnesses that people are presenting with. So it is always going to be a challenge to then present to you 2 years after a piece of legislation is reported. Hey, guess what? We saved X lives. We found this number of people who are having exposures, but they're not dead and they're not super sick yet, and now they don't have any ongoing exposure. It's very hard for us to be able to do that, as it is with most environmental pathogens, unfortunately. Some health effects, as we know with cancer, have what we call a latency effect, which means you get exposed at a point in time, but it may be decades later when you see the impact of that. As an aside, I hear from Bennington a lot with PFAS compounds, with cancers that are appropriate for PFAS. And it's very hard for me to say PFAS had nothing to do with that or it had a lot to do with that, but it's certainly consistent with PFAS exposure. And we're seeing more individuals, but we're never going to see enough to say there's a clear cluster related to PFAS in Bennington because of the way these things play out. Additionally, health effects can be passed on for generations. There's just a lot of issues that are a little harder to be as transparent about just because of the nature of what we're dealing with. But to summarize, what we are dealing with is we definitely know there are PCBs in some schools. We know that they are definitely toxic chemicals and don't have to add to the literature on that. We know it's very time consuming and at times costly to remove them. So we don't deny that at all, but we also cannot ignore the science and know that they do pose potentially long-lasting health effects to the students and to the staff who may work there for many more years than some of the students are passing through. So I'm going to stop there and let the segue to Secretary Moore, and then maybe we can do questions after. If that's okay.
Does anyone have any pressing questions? Just want to make sure the computer's. Okay, then we'll wait for a second.
Switch seats.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, Madam Secretary.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for having me. For the record, Julie Moore, A&R. And I think I saw a set of this document go around. All right. So what I thought I could walk you through is what I think of as a proposed retooling of the PCB testing program. And the reason this is particularly timely at this moment is this is part of our budget adjustment request that we were in Senate Appropriations regarding earlier today. And so Dr. Levine covered some of the wave tops in terms of the number of schools that are part of the testing program. We're looking at 324 in total that were either built or renovated before 1980. And therefore need indoor air testing. And the statistics of what we've seen to date. What we have come to realize is that parts of the program were more expensive than we anticipated originally. And in particular, the way we approach PCB testing in schools is we deploy canisters. The canisters effectively collect a representative sample of everything in the air in that room. And when we have an exceedance of the health department's action level, we then turn and start looking at what specific sources there may be in a room. That materials testing, that second step, has been more expensive than anticipated. And so part of our budget adjustment proposal is to transfer $3.5 million from our solid waste management fund into the environmental contingency fund. And that is the fund being used to pay for portions of this work. In addition, that money is complemented by a reserve that was created in the education fund. There was a total of $29.5 million in that reserve. 16 of it was dedicated to Burlington High School in last year's budget. And we have an unexpended balance currently of $9.1 million in that reserve. And so our proposal is to use the funding in the DEC budget, which is roughly about $4.5 million, to continue to pay for the inventories, the indoor air sampling, and the materials testing, and then rely on that remaining balance in the education fund where mitigation or remediation is needed. On the second page of the handout, we indicate how we will prioritize the use of that available funding. So focusing first on school facilities that have primary spaces where PCB detections exceed the immediate action level. And by primary spaces, we're talking about classrooms, libraries, cafeteria, and nurse's office, as opposed to ancillary spaces or non-primary spaces, which are things like hallways, bathrooms, and closets. And we have seen detections in those spaces in part because we believe they may not have the same level of air handling and circulation as in the primary spaces. We really anticipate with the budget available, it will be sufficient to support our work through the end of fiscal year 25, by which point we will have completed testing in roughly half of Vermont schools. And that the money that remains in the Ed Fund Reserve would be sufficient to support the sort of mitigation and remediation that's described in more detail in this document. There are several reasons for making this shift. One is feedback we've heard regarding larger school facility construction needs and concerns that this is an inefficient use of resources to get in and do a targeted renovation project, absent thinking more broadly about school facility needs, and feel like this balances the health concerns Dr. Levine was speaking to with the reality that a lot of our school buildings need investments that go well beyond anything that's envisioned by this program. The other, to my mind, benefit of this revised approach is by having the materials testing work funded out of our environmental contingency fund. It means that A&R will hire the contractors directly to do that work, because another piece of feedback we've received is that that materials testing, the program as a whole, but the materials testing specifically, has resulted in a significant administrative burden for schools. And so we will be able to relieve some of that by hiring and managing the contractors directly, which wasn't something we were able to do when that work was being paid for out of the education fund. On the third page of the handout, it gives you a sense for what we're seeing in terms of typical costs. Now that we're about a third of the way through the sampling program, obviously it varies somewhat depending on the size of the school building. But we've come up with averages based on those first 90+ schools where we've completed. In terms of the inventory in that initial air sampling, that's a much smaller range. If you start to look at the materials sampling, that's where the range starts to grow pretty wide. And estimating how far we'll be able to carry forward with the sampling program, given the resources available, which assumes you approve the BAA request. We did use those high-end sampling or costs in the second table on page 3. So we believe we have a fairly conservative estimate. And if you flip to the fourth page, you'll see we actually end up a little bit in the red. These are all projections, and we are committed to managing that sampling effort to sort of over the next 18 months to live within the budget that's presented here. But because we've assumed the highest end cost for each of those material sampling programs, we are cautiously optimistic that we will be able to complete all of the work laid out here within those available resources. In addition, we have had a number of school facilities where there has been need for some mitigation or remediation effort in 3 buildings thus far. We've actually had to make physical changes to the buildings, window replacements, metal taping, and sealant paints to cover up areas of particularly high PCB levels. Those remediations have cost between $500,000 and $1.5 million. And so we projected out an additional 7 schools that would need that sort of intervention. And again, believe the $9+ million within the education fund reserve currently should be sufficient to meet that need. Obviously, the next question is what happens after the end of fiscal year 25? And just want to offer that I'm here to work in partnership with the General Assembly to figure out the second half of this work. That the proposal in front of you currently is specific to completing that first half of school testing and carrying us through the end of fiscal year 25. The only other thing I would note is we did, in early days of the program, develop sort of a set of risk scoring criteria that we use to prioritize schools. I don't want to give you a sense that it is a perfect methodology, but we did endeavor to prioritize our testing to what we felt were the highest risk facilities first, based on facility age, as well as some of the social vulnerabilities of the surrounding community. And so are hopeful we may see fewer positive results as we continue through the program, but there's certainly more unknowns than knowns. And I don't want to, as I say, provide some sense of false assurance.
But again, just for clarity, so the first 1/3 of schools that are tested or scheduled to be tested were ones that you thought that the risk level was highest based on a variety of conditions. I didn't.
Correct.
I heard.
Yeah, no, the criteria for prioritization were based on different periods in history where we believe there was higher risk. Specifically, the risk was highest in buildings built between 1950 and 1980, even though PCB stayed all the way back to the 20s. Whether there'd been HVAC work that had been done in the school, whether there's construction plan going forward, because similar to asbestos testing, a lot of schools need to engage in materials testing before they actually demolish a part of their building. So they'd have to do this anyways. Here's a way to partner these 2 activities. If there's a child care in the building, recognize that smaller children are at greater risk. So those sorts of characteristics.
Senator Buell.
Thank you very much for being here today. And thank you for giving us a second look at the program as a whole. I appreciate that. I think it's complex enough that it required a second look, maybe even a third and a fourth look. So thank you. I do have some questions and some comments, and I want to preface everything I say with one particular comment, which is that I spent the whole summer, part of the summer on the school construction aid task force. And it was very eye-opening and really interesting. And my my end thought after all of that work was that, our North Star as a state should be absolutely 100% to have schools that are toxin free. Absolutely, let's get there. That should be our goal. In the short term though, I have, questions and comments, of course, as we learn and grow and research. And I wasn't here when this legislation was passed. I was not a senator at the time, and who knows, I may have voted for this legislation. But I'd also like to think that I would have the capacity to learn and possibly even change some of my thoughts on this program. Because it's been an evolution for me for sure. So one question I have is how you prioritize PCBs over other toxins. And one thing that's come to light recently is that we have a bunch of schools, and I don't know the exact number in our state, that do not have potable water. And so their kids, children, teachers are drinking copious amounts of water from plastic bottles. And I have now gone down this rabbit hole about the nanotoxins that they're discovering in plastics that they didn't even know they were there. I think they said 10 to 100 times higher than previously thought. And those health effects aren't completely known yet, but it does look as though these nanoplastics are crossing blood-brain barriers, they're entering into the placenta, they're found in the urine, so they're all over our body. I'm wondering how, PCBs get prioritized over that. And I also wonder, because we're all in Senate Health and Welfare, and we talk a lot about obesity as an incredibly concerning health risk, especially childhood obesity. And one scenario that I've recently experienced is that one of the elementary schools in my district, Champlain Elementary, has a PCB level of 48 nanograms per cubic meter in their gym. So the pre-K kids can no longer exercise in the gym a couple times a week. That in itself is problematic because I do know that we have kids, especially kids from vulnerable populations, who that is the only time they get to exercise. Those 2 moments in the week or 3 moments or whatever, that's it. And then another, and again, like there's so many domino effects to all of this. What I've heard from someone I know who works there, she's in the central office, these kindergarten kids and first grade kids, their parents are freaked out about these PCBs. So she has to sit in a room with those kids because they will not partake in gym, even though apparently 48 nanograms isn't that concerning for them. So I'm just wondering again, like, how do we choose one over another? That is really, really concerning to me in the grand scheme.
Sure, maybe I can start with the drinking water issue and then we'll certainly turn to Dr. Levine about the obesity question.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, I believe the schools you're referring to are schools that are on a do not drink notice because of PFAS contamination in their school water. The levels of acceptable PFAS in drinking water were calculated by the toxicologists at the health department, similar to the PCBs, and it's based on a cancer risk, an acceptable cancer risk. So I would argue that those standards were set using a similar process and to provide a similar level of health protection. I want to assure you we're doing everything we can through our Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division at the Agency of Natural Resources to help make sure that those schools are able to either bring their existing drinking water source back online with treatment that addresses the underlying PFAS contamination, or in some instances, we've determined that the best, most cost-effective solution is to drill a new well if the existing well had been relatively shallow and subject to contamination. That takes time. Those are capital intensive construction projects. We have other funding that we use to support that work. But in every instance where we've detected PFAS as part of the state's implementation of our PFAS roadmap and our surface water and drinking water monitoring strategy, we are actively engaged with those communities and schools so that bottled water should not be a long-term solution. It's an interim measure to address the high levels of PFAS that were found. there may be schools with other reasons, for being on bottled water, but I guess I'm not aware.
No, it seemed like it was PFAS. That's what my question is, like, are we doing something to fix those water sources so that they're not drinking PFAS and they're not drinking out of plastic water bottles?
We are, so as soon as a detection, is confirmed, we take an initial sample. If it exceeds our standards, we take a confirmatory sample before we launch into a very expensive and complicated, technically complex process. Once those concentrations are confirmed, we issue a do not drink order, but then immediately begin work with the school to ultimately ensure that there's a safe drinking water supply.
May I ask something about PFAS while we're on it? I don't want to go down a different path here, but I'm just curious. It looks like one of the articles mentioned Craftsberry. What's the source? Do you know?
So
What's that?
I would defer to Matt as the sites program
Okay.
is in his shop, but I don't think we know.
I think at this point, we.
Mr. Channel, if you mind,
I-
just think,
I apologize.
identifying yourself with the right, I have so few opportunities to have you in committee. I just want the people to know you're here.
Thank you, Senator. Matt Chapman, I'm the Director of the Waste Management Prevention Division with the DEC. So I think it's safe to say, I mean, we have some suspicions on what might be going on, but I think that we have not been able to determine what the source of contamination is there. And I guess I do think it's important just to be on PFAS for a second.
Please.
The levels and concentrations that are problematic with PFAS, we're seeing well contamination from septic systems being a challenge and an issue from people washing their clothes. So.
And so but they're high enough in Craftsberries, having lived through this in Bennington, that students have again been taken off of, and was it just a random test that was done? Was there any, how did you find it? How did they find it?
So this was actually, it's the Craftsberry, I believe it's the Craftsberry Fire District. So it's the
Right.
public community water system
I
in
see.
Craftsberry that is
Yeah.
on a do not drink and are being provided bottled water.
Okay.
Well, we have systematically been testing every public water supply statewide since that PFAS was discovered in Bennington. And have recently undertaken a randomized sampling of private wells serving individual homes as well, and in an effort to better understand the true extent of contamination.
Thank you very much. Dr. Beaver.
Yeah, where do I start? So
I don't know.
I do know, and I'm not sure if it's continuing, that we actually have been testing bottled water at this point in time. So that we could recommend which ones might be better than others in terms of contaminants in the bottled water supply. But I agree with the plastics issue, and it's question really now, in light of current research and what we do and don't know, is where in the hierarchy do we put these nanoparticles? Do we put the endocrine disruption aspect of plastics? It's like you uncover another problem every time you try to solve a problem. And that is unfortunately the state of our environment in general. Not to be a doomsayer totally though, but the reality is, even with PCBs, there are some that think the levels we've set are low, yet they're actually much higher than what we used to call the screening level, and higher than what you can detect in the environment in the average person. So it's not to say that just because you're not in a school in a room that we found a lot of PCBs in, that you haven't already had a problem based on your environment that you live in. And the PFAS compounds, unfortunately, are in the same category where we all carry a burden and we have to draw the line somewhere about where that burden becomes too great and too risky for the population at large.
I know you want to speak to obesity, which I appreciate. But so if there is such an importance around PCBs, which there seems to be, why are we not testing private daycare centers and private preschools, which are strewn across the state? We also do early ed in our committee, so we know that they are out there and that they contain a lot of children, young children. So I'm curious about that.
So I think Secretary Moore can chime in. Part of the answer to that has to do with relative dates of construction of facilities. Many of these facilities are homes as opposed to actual huge structures like a school. And the reality is there's differences in opportunity for ventilation, amount of time a child might spend, half a day versus a full day plus extracurricular, what have you. So there's a lot of different issues surrounding it. I don't think the yield would be so high, to be honest, just based on what we already know from the facilities. We went through a little bit of this when we were dealing with the lead in pipes and in drinking water. And it was a whole different world, childcare settings versus schools that have been constructed years and years ago and fixtures from who knows when. That's my answer to this.
I think there's also different building materials too, just to add on, you know, just in constructing a giant building for potentially hundreds of students, you're going to use different materials and.
My kids went to school in the synagogue in Burlington, Ohio Zedek. It's actually quite large building that was probably built around the time of the schools, so it probably has PCBs in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we are in a bit of uncharted waters, right? And it's certainly not to suggest that there aren't other sources of PCB exposure that people are, excuse me, likely to encounter in their daily lives. But this felt like a reasonable universe to carve off. To be frank, the agency back in 2013 had done a very small pilot program over concerns with PCBs in schools. We had tested about 5 schools, worked with colleagues at the health department to review those results and determined none of what we found there was problematic. And so frankly, went about our business and didn't pursue that further. What happened at Burlington High School was a real eye opener for us in terms of some of the concentrations that were found. And so it kind of came back to that issue and needed to put a boundary around something. And it's not to suggest that there aren't other concerns outside of that boundary, but very much as Dr. Levine indicated, some mitigating factors and this seemed like the right place to start.
With the exercise part,
Yes.
I agree with you completely that that's of concern. And the reality is, number one, let's assume for the moment we're talking about SAL and not an IAL exceedance. We would do some of the mitigating strategies that you've heard about and try to see if we actually achieve success and if those students could be more quickly inserted back into the setting. Number two, and I don't say this cavalierly, I mean, the creativity of our educators and the innovativeness of them is important to respect. And I would suspect they would be able to start to find some of those solutions for that age group that couldn't potentially be in the setting that conducive to that exercise and vision.
Thank you. Right done. Just finished. Thank you. This is I'm wrapping up. I would just say, like, so often, there's a perfect storm of so many things going on at the same time, as you well know. But if these numbers are, they do give you pause. And I did meet with another district Monday, on Zoom, they have some testing coming up and they are terrified because they are just feeling like they don't have the capacity to deal with it. I know you've heard that before. We've watched testimony in other committees, we've heard it. And then my last thing is just, we appreciate the 60 million that you put aside for Burlington, but that money has not been handed out yet. It is still sitting somewhere, and would be very, very hopeful to that particular district that has been extremely challenged, as you well know. And so if there's something that we need to do in statute to trigger the release of that money, please, if you could let us know, that would be great. Thank you.
So again, to echo my colleagues, thank you for the testimony. It's a great update on a critical topic. I have one concern and I have three questions. If I could, they're all short. So the concern is first, we know we live in essentially, not again to be, as Dr. Levine said, to kind of doom and gloom, but we live in kind of a toxic soup of cleaning materials and construction materials, et cetera. And setting the standards of what is toxic and what isn't toxic. We know that we have to live or at least offer public spaces that are within the band of, less toxic, acceptably toxic, I guess. So I do remain concerned that the difference between the Vermont level of toxicity on PCBs and the EPA level. I don't understand the disconnect. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today, but being that, the huge costs to test and then mitigate PCBs across we're talking only schools now. It's a huge number. And then of course, as another member of the school construction task force, there's other issues which compound potential costs for renovations and improvements of our statewide school systems. So that's my concern. So a couple questions. The other 2/3 of schools, do you anticipate the need to go back to those schools, look at the risk criteria and say, okay, we're going to cherry pick a couple more based on, like lessons learned from the first third? Is there another cycle of this?
I would defer to Matt. I don't believe we plan to re-characterize the risk. We're just continuing to work down that initial assessment.
Okay, good. And then,
Because all the schools were assessed on the same parameters, same metrics, as a whole list of them. And so, as Secretary Moore said, the science may not be perfect, but the process is consistent. So, if you're in this second half of the schools that would be done after fiscal year 25, the majority of them should be in the lower risk group, but we can't guarantee something won't turn out. I don't think reassessing them would change.
okay, all right, thank you. And then back to my colleagues' comments regarding the Burlington PCB issue. So while there was 16 million dedicated, the total cost was somewhere around 200 million for school reconstruction. What have you? Do you remain confident that the remainder of your budget, 25 million or so, or the 25 million total, is sufficient to mitigate the things which we're discovering on a daily basis, or will continue to discover from the first third of schools that are being tested? Is that a sufficient?
I do. I mean, this is a more targeted and nuanced strategy than what Burlington selected to deal with PCB contamination. I don't know that would have been what would have come out of the other end of our corrective action planning process, where we weigh cost effectiveness of remediation versus the full reconstruction that the school opted for.
Okay, all right, that's fair. And then, here we're really tunnel visioned on schools, education. But the question for PCBs is bigger. Municipal offices, state offices, childcare centers, the prisons. Is there another phase of this, which is, outside the scope of this committee that the state intends to pursue for testing purposes?
I would say not currently. And I think part of it would be to be able to have benefit of the full data set from schools, and then have that conversation about where this sits on the relative list of priorities for the state.
Very good, thank you.
I concur. We would owe it to the scientific community and to the education community to be able to publish what we find.
Absolutely.
And since we are the first and only in the country. If I could respond to your concern, 3 bullet
EPA.
points.
Could you respond also to the EPA question? I mean, you
That's what that's the
but I
concern we
appreciate
have,
that.
yeah. So number one, the EPA's levels and the risks assessment is literally 30 years old. And it did not incorporate current knowledge about some of these non-cancer effects, like the neurodevelopmental specific. So that's one. Number two is that the methodology that the EPA used would protect the average person, meaning it would protect 50% of the population. We used a different methodology, which in the toxicology world protects 95%. So more protective. And there's
Is it because they didn't include, youngsters, where they really focused 30 years ago on adults, or what's the genesis?
that gets to the third point I was gonna make, which is the EPA's was much more directed towards residential settings, whereas ours are very directed towards school population settings. So the kinds of exposures you get in these kinds of facilities like a school. So that's just sort of 101 level of what I give you on that. But it all goes into how toxicologists calculate risk and assess that. So there's three fundamental areas where we differ from the EPA and where our levels are more protective, and which, at least in conversations with responsible scientists at the EPA, they are aligned with us completely. And in fact, they have done so much consultation in Burlington. They are a major part of what was going on in Burlington. And they were very much aligned with the methodology we put out, as were other consultants we used around the country, of which there aren't that many in the area of the PCB.
Senator Williams.
Just an easy question. So I had some of my constituents who were educators that contacted me and asked me to stop the testing because they're concerned about their budgets and everything else. Yes. The testing is going to continue, correct? And we're going to do all the schools
So
initially, but
that is,
Right.
yes, we plan to test all the schools. The resources we currently have will take us through the end of FY25.
Senator Gulick,
I just want to clarify.
sure, is that right, Senator Gulick? Okay.
So when you say testing all the schools, you mean testing all the 1/3 of the schools which were identified as having highest risk?
No, we've completed testing of that initial
Oh.
third. The proposal in front of you will continue that work, and we have enough resources to get through half the schools. We will need to come and have that conversation about completing.
Good. Perfect.
I was just hoping to either question or maybe correct something that you said, Secretary Moore, just because I know I'll be getting a lot of emails from my constituents if I don't. The strategy that Burlington used in terms of dealing with the PCB situation that we had. I do want to just remind folks that the levels of PCBs did change, the action levels after the testing. I know DEC changed the levels, and then I also just wanted to say that I don't believe, maybe there was, but I don't believe there was a mitigation and remediation strategy in place at the time. I think that came later. Is that right? Okay, good.
But there was
As long
no
as I
formal program
say
in
that.
place.
Right, there was no formal program. Okay, and my last and final question, I promise. We have the only school testing program in the country. Is it the only school testing program in the world? I was trying to find out if there's one anywhere else, but I couldn't. Okay,
I don't know the answer, but I will see if my staff know the answer.
Yeah,
thank you.
we were briefed last year on other countries that other countries have been conducting, but we're using different testing level. Remember that conversation?
There's something about the EU, I think.
Yeah, but I don't know if they have a school testing program.
Let me try to get that information.
Thank you.
Anything else for Secretary Moore? Mr. Chapman, Ms. Gendron, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great testimony. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Appreciate your time.
Earlier than I thought. Committee, any questions? Chapman, Sears and I watched MASH, 7 and 8. Anytime.
I need
time.
Okay, okay.
Old school,
I'll be over.
old
I'll be over. I mean.
You're welcome, 2 seconds. Yeah.
The previous person was my family member, Sarah.
You're
Yeah.
kidding,
I
how
was
great.
I didn't know she was gonna be here.
Oh, that's
on
great.
Tuesday.
Yeah.
I'm taking photos of
Guys,
it.
you keep that open.
Keep it open?
Yeah, thanks. Committee.
I watched MASH between 12 and 8.
Yeah, me too.
But that was years old,
Yeah.
not time.
We get this room tested.
I think we're
Radar.
finished unless there's anything, yeah, there was a lot of, we also had a test, I think, at one point, there were a couple of rooms, I think Senate Natural was tested at one point for allergies related to, am I thinking of, things that, fungi, molds, things like that.
Like, well, are we still on?
We are, so unless I see any other questions or